A nation can survive its fools, and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within.
They've been wrong about the wars. They've been wrong about jobs. They've been wrong about everything. The question is, are they stupid or do they have a plan? I actually think for the most part, they have a plan, but some are not too smart.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show, the anti-globalist America First program dedicated to dehoaxing the media and destroying the narrative. Here's your host, the founder and editor of the Daily Stir, Matt Wingard.
Welcome to the Horrible Deplorable Show. I am Matt Wingard, and with me as always is my good friend Doris. Hello, Doris.
Hello, Matt.
So we do this for the Gab community, but the audience has grown. You can find this podcast on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, and we play at 5 p.m. on Saturday and Sunday on the405media.com. If you like this show, please share it with a friend and write a review online. So this week, the president was faced with the issue of DACA. Now, the garbage press did not want to give all of the facts around this, but essentially about a dozen Republican attorney generals were getting ready to sue on DACA because the deferred action, that's deferred action for childhood arrivals, but there was another program for parents, and that had already been challenged in court, and the court had said that it was unconstitutional for President Obama to have done that by executive order, and so that program, which never had gone into effect, was ruled unconstitutional. DACA was created under the exact same legal reasoning, so everybody understood that the challenge would be successful and that the program would have to close. So the press tried to make it all about Trump being heartless, but the facts of the matter were that the program had to come to an end, and what the president did was delay it for 6 months to give Congress a chance to act. So the idea that somehow he's being heartless is absolutely ridiculous, but that's the narrative that the press wants to push, so they will do that. So during the press conference this week, Attorney General Sessions was sent out, and everybody said, oh, Trump is hiding because he doesn't want to make the announcement. Well, actually, they sent the Attorney General out because this was a legal decision based on the facts that I just outlined, and so they wanted the top legal enforcement officer of the country, Jeff Sessions, to carefully explain the Constitution and the law to the press, which they dutifully then ignored and went right out and began saying horrible things about Trump about. But that was the point, was to follow the law and have the Attorney General explain the Constitution and the law to the press. They didn't care. So another thing the press won't tell you is that the average age of the DACA kids is 22 to 24. Some of them are as old as 36. They were brought here as minors by their parents when they were all illegal, and they try to give you this idea that it's a bunch of 4-year-olds coming across the border. But actually, for every 4-year-old that was brought over, there was a 16-year-old or a 17-year-old that was brought over as well. So the idea that all of these DACA recipients, there's about 800,000 of them, the idea that all of them know no other country but the United States is ridiculous. Many of them probably spent the vast majority of their childhoods in another country, and I guarantee you, with their parents being illegal and being from Mexico or Venezuela or wherever that is that they're from, some of them are from China, I guarantee you that some of these children, probably a noticeable percentage, have actually been back to their home country or have visited relatives, or relatives have met them somewhere. So the idea that they're completely unfamiliar with the country that they came from is, for the most part, probably a lie. I think that the president has set the GOP up perfectly, because at this point, they can't pass DACA and not pass Obamacare reform and tax cuts without looking like they are completely divorced from the base. It's suicide. Now, they may do it because they've shown us time and time again that they are completely in the pocket of the Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and not interested in doing what their voters actually want. But this is why we have to take scalps next year, and a lot of them. I would also say that the DACA deportees in 6 months can thank John McCain, because remember, he was the critical vote against Obamacare repeal and replace, and he's the one that's put the GOP in the position where if they had gotten other things done, if they'd been chugging along with the Trump agenda, it might have been politically possible for them to get away with some amnesty program for DACA and Trump voters and Republicans, while angry, and I certainly wouldn't have liked it, but at least there would have been other accomplishments to point to as an offset. Because they have managed to do absolutely nothing, as I said, it is absolute political suicide for them to have their only accomplishment be that they pass amnesty for illegal aliens, right? So they were unable to do anything for the citizens of the United States, but they can do something for foreigners. It would be the end of them. And so if they do not end up doing anything on DACA and those men and women are deported, they can thank John McCain for helping that along. I think it's interesting that the 6 months that the president has given them runs them right up into their primaries. So they're going to make this decision. If they were to grant amnesty to the DACA men and women, then they will be right up against their primaries when they do that. It's a very difficult vote to take. A lot of them are already beginning to think about their reelection, certainly all the congressmen and women, but by January, they will all be focused entirely on their reelections and not wanting to have a primary challenge. So the last thing they're going to want to be doing is granting amnesty to illegal aliens in the election cycle. Primaries are everything next year. We're going to have to clean house. Just imagine if the GOP is actually able to address this, but unable to do Obamacare, tax cuts, infrastructure, spending, budget cuts. I just don't see it happening. But then, Doris, what do you think? Are they going to pass something for DACA?
If they just pass DACA alone without tying it to one of these other things or a future program that doesn't allow this going forward, they're fools.
So you're suggesting if it was part of a broader immigration package, they might be able to slip it in. I think that's true. I don't see DACA passing by itself. I think they know they can't do that. But they're, of course, going to try to do the absolute minimum to offset it. Now, what they need, what any reasonable deal to grant 800,000 people amnesty would have to give the folks who are for immigration reform almost everything that we want. Anything less, there's no reason to give anything less than that because DACA is the leverage. And once you give that away, you no longer have that leverage anymore. And there's really nothing else to trade. So you need an end to birthright citizenship. You need the RAISE Act that Tom Cotton and the president put forward, which totally changes the 1964 Immigration Act so that we're now doing a point system like Canada and New Zealand and other places, and there's no more chain migration. It reduces the number of legal immigration from 1 million a year to something less than that. I think you need reform of H-1B visas in there as well. And you need E-Verify. Oh, you got to have the wall funding in there as well. That's the other piece of it. In order to make sure that you are permanently changing the conditions. Because, of course, granting 800,000 people amnesty just encourages more illegal acts. And I just don't think that there's going to be any agreement that's going to get those things. Right now, I'm hearing a little bit of talk about just doing some wall funding and E-Verify, or just doing the parts of the RAISE Act and E-Verify. That's really not enough. Remember that when Obama created the DACA program, that created a whole influx of young people, minors without parents, flooding across the border. So unless you're doing basically all of the immigration reforms that we need, you cannot grant amnesty to anyone.
But do you think Trump will be able to hold out?
I don't know what he's inclined to sign. I think, like I said, it's a mistake. The only leverage you have is the DACA program to get everything else. And if you trade that away for less, you'll never get the other things. So everyone should understand that if any deal is made around DACA, that is the only deal that will ever be made. There will be no secondary deal. So if it doesn't contain things like wall funding or an end to birthright citizenship or what have you, then that stuff's never going to happen. It has to happen as part of this because once they have DACA, they have absolutely no reason to trade for anything else.
The thing of it is, the general public would be perfectly happy with stopping the immigration policy that we've had if we allow the DACAs to remain. That will make all the bleeding heart liberals feel good. No one will be able to say it's unfair, and we fix the problem going forward.
You're suggesting if there was a big immigration package.
Mm-hmm.
I think the public would support that. I mean, I know that, like, for instance, I would not be happy with the amnesty being granted to DACA. But if it was part of a very serious reform of our immigration system, I do think that would be satisfying to probably a majority of Americans. Remember that And in any deal, no one should be entirely happy. So if I were getting all of the items that I've listed, the wall, the RAISE Act, so no more chain migration, an end to birthright citizenship, and the rest, E-Verify, I still wouldn't want to give those 800,000 amnesties, but you have to give something in a deal. It is the only thing I can think of that would motivate some of these Chamber of Commerce Republicans and Democrats to vote for a deal. And I think that there's no reason to settle for less. I'll make this last point. The president has the powers to deport, and he's already driving down the number of refugees, and it's basically not including any Muslim refugees into the country now. So he has the power over 8 years, and I've said this before, he needs to ramp up the deportations, but he can deport and deport and deport. So he has all the leverage he needs to force the deal that he wants. Because if there's no deal, the one downside is that the next Democrat president can go back to letting more people in. But the upside is that he can deport a lot of people in 8 years. And that should be a motivation to the other side to come to the table and deal, because people who are deported, it's very difficult sometimes for them to get back in, especially if the president is ratcheting it all down. So I say increase the number of deportations. He's done the DACA thing now where he's given them 6 months to come to an agreement. If I were in his position and I didn't like the deal that was forming, I would begin to turn the screws on immigration. I would tell ICE to double the amount of people that they are deporting on a weekly basis until I got more things added to the immigration deal. And if I still wasn't satisfied, then I would have ICE double the deportation numbers again. You see, that's the leverage point you have as president, is just to keep turning the screws on them until they basically cry uncle and say, I want this to stop, I want the deportations to stop, I have certain people I want to see be allowed to stay, and so I will trade everything else away to do that.
I have confidence in our great deal maker in President Trump, but I worry that the Democrats will give up votes by not letting open immigration.
Yeah, they certainly have an incentive to not deal, because they may just want to wait him out. They, of course, probably think that they can either get him impeached or defeat him in the next re-election. So they figure this is just a short-term period of deportations they need to get past. And so they may very well dig their heels in and decide they don't really want to make a deal. They want to wait him out. But that, again, is why he needs to respond by increasing the number of deportations that are being done. And if need be, once DACA people are being deported, they're not necessarily ever going to come back. So that's something the Democrats have to think about. The other thing is that when he wins re-election in 2020, they may decide at that point they don't want to spend another 4 years watching deportations, and they'll make their deal. We'll just have to see. The idea is to drive a hard bargain. I like the position that the president's in. Of all three of the negotiating positions, the Chamber of Commerce Republicans, the Democrats, and President Trump, I would, in any kind of a role-playing game, I would take his position, because I think he has all the leverage points to turn up the fire on them. So we'll see how that plays out and whether or not Chamber of Commerce Republicans are ready to commit complete suicide. But we'll see what happens.
Here's an interesting question. Does the government even know who these 800,000 people are?
Yeah, they do in this case, because they all had to register for the program, which is one of the things they're crying about, which is they've given their address and everything that ICE needs to deport them because they came forward and identified themselves as illegal and gave their point of contact and all of that. That was something that was brought up at the time when Obama made the program. There were people who said, if you volunteer and come forward for this program, you're identifying yourself to ICE, and it may not always be a friendly administration, but they were, of course, all convinced it was going to be Hillary and they would never have to worry, and they got Trump. So yeah, there were some people who qualified for this program who never stepped forward for just this reason, because they didn't want to be identified. So we'll see how it all plays out. There was a meeting on the debt ceiling and the budget at the White House this week also between Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, Paul Ryan, and the president. And McConnell and Ryan the debt ceiling needs to be raised because they're not going to cut the budget. More reasons why these guys have to go. They wanted to raise the debt ceiling for 18 months, so to raise it by enough money that it would be good for 18 months. And that would get them past the elections because, of course, as we all have come to understand, they're complete weasels. So Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer made the argument that it should just be 3 months, do a budget resolution, a continuing resolution, a CR for 3 months, and only raise the debt ceiling for 3 months, which puts all of the big decisions into December. And the president shook their hand and took the deal. And McConnell and Ryan have been spitting nails ever since, and I'm somehow supposed to feel some sympathy for them, but I like that he chose the deal that puts the pressure on the Republicans. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that Schumer and Pelosi wanted this because it puts the pressure on the Republicans, and they want the Republicans to make tough decisions going into the election cycle. But I don't care, because the Republicans haven't been making any tough decisions this year at all. And they need to be forced, whether it's by the president or by the Democrats, they need to be forced to make the tough decisions. And they better worry about the fact that they have to face us in primaries before they ever worry about the generals. I know that they are concerned about losing the House, but I think they should be focused on their primaries, because I think a lot of challengers are coming this year to knock out a bunch of Republicans.
So is there any chance that McConnell or Ryan would be removed from their head's position?
If either one of them lost the chamber, I think they would lose their job as the leader, yes. But I don't think it takes just that. It wouldn't take very many incumbents losing their primary races for there to be a movement to replace Ryan. I'm no fan of Ryan, but I don't happen to think that he is the core of the problem in the House. There are a lot of members that need to be replaced. Remember that the conservative caucus supported Ryan when they wanted to get rid of Boehner. And I don't necessarily have as much ire for Ryan as I do for McConnell, because Ryan passed things through the House. He has put a lot of the Trump agenda through the House. He may or may not always agree with it, but he's gotten it through. The fact that nothing's happening is on McConnell and on a bunch of members of the Senate Republican caucus, like McCain and Lindsey Graham and others who are blocking it, Ben Sass and the rest. So, in the end, all of this evil work by Chamber of Commerce Republicans in the Senate may end up costing Paul Ryan his job. I'm not going to weep for him, but that's not really where the train wreck has been. It has been in the Senate. And I think, as we've discussed in the previous podcast, I don't think the Republicans are headed for a minority status in the Senate. The stars are just lined up wrong for that. There are 10 Democrats up for re-election in Trump states. Republicans are likely to either be the same or to gain seats no matter what. That's why I believe we have a free shot at taking some of these guys out in their primaries, and why I've said time and time again we need to target Flake in Arizona and Heller in Nevada and Corker in Tennessee, because they're up and we can send a message. Even if we replaced them with candidates that were not as strong in the general election, and all three of those people lost their seats in the general election, I still believe the Senate will have a majority, because yes, 3 off of 52 is 49, but we're going to win somewhere in the vicinity of at least half of those blue state those Trump state races where Democrats currently hold the seat. So the chances are good that we're still going to be back at 52, 53, 55, somewhere in that vicinity. And that's why we need to take this opportunity to target some of these Republicans. I do think if we knock off a few Republicans in their primaries, they'll understand that Mitch McConnell cannot continue as the leader, because they're all going to want to save their own necks, and it's easy to offer him up as a scapegoat at that moment. I constantly online see people who are Trump supporters who are perplexed or concerned about some move that Trump makes or his style. And I'm going to go back to something I've said before, because I don't see the president acting any different than he's acted from day one. So if you're on board the Trump train, you're on board. And there really shouldn't be much hand-wringing over what we see. It really only takes 3 things to understand Trump. First of all, understand that when he was young, the head of his church was Norman Vincent Peale, who wrote a very, very famous book, The Power of Positive Thinking. I suggest to anyone who wants to understand Trump that you go out and read, if you haven't already, Norman Vincent Peale's book, the crux of which is essentially to self-talk, to always put a positive spin on things, and to state the reality that you want, even if it's not true, because you can make it true through the power of your positive thinking. And if you understand the arguments that Norman Vincent Peale was making in that book, it explains a lot of what you hear coming out of Trump's mouth. He obviously absorbed that at a young age, and he has made it his reality his entire life. He states the facts as he wants them to be and keeps stating them until they become that. So when he says during the campaign, we're going to win, don't worry, we're going to win, and then he wins. He makes it happen through the power of positive thinking. And when he says the wall is going to happen, don't worry, the wall is going to happen, he will make it happen. I have absolute faith in that. Secondly, Donald Trump grew up in Queens, and New York is not Nebraska. Anybody looking for Dwight D. Eisenhower needs to understand the two men were raised in different places. Jeff Sessions is from Alabama, from the genteel South. Donald Trump is from Queens, New York, where when you walk out on the street, there are boys there ready to challenge you and to punch you in the face to see if you will punch back. And it's just a rough and tumble place. Listen to comedians who grew up in New York City and what their childhood was like. Listen to any boy who went out and played in the streets in New York growing up, and the stories are very similar, and you'll understand with the Italian and Irish and and German mix that's going on there, and then the Puerto Ricans came in. There's a Hispanic mix, but people are fighters. These are tough cultures, and you just don't survive in New York by being a wallflower or by being a suck-up. And New York rewards the pugilist in a way that Oklahoma does not, okay? So the idea that somebody is a bit obnoxious and that they kind of jet their chin out or they lead with their chin and that they punch back as hard as they get punched rather than taking the high road or turning the other cheek, this is not New York City style at all. And once people who have lived there get this, and people who've spent any time studying it get it. If you haven't really thought about it, or if you've never spent any time there experiencing it, then it will seem very foreign, but it's very natural for New York. So, of course, on a national stage, it can look odd to some people, but within the confines of New York City, it looks very normal to folks there. And then, thirdly, I would say, understand the New York media. The national media is mostly based in New York. And so there's all this talent that accumulates in New York. So the best, well, let me rephrase this. When I say best, the sharpest journalists make their way through markets, and New York is often the goal. So you have the toughest knife fighters in the media located in New York. People who've clawed and scratched and bitten their way to the top of the media heap over many decades to get there and then to maintain it. And if you've seen any movie about the fashion industry or any industry that's located in New York, you know that there's this constant portrayal of the idea that it's cutthroat and that people will sell their own mother to maintain their position. No one has ever done or tried to sell America on the idea that New York is this place where everybody pats each other on the back and supports each other. It's a dog-eat-dog environment, and the media is that way too. So these are vicious folks constantly trying to make their bones or their own name on bringing down a powerful person in the city. So to exist as a developer or a man in business or a woman in business in New York means to have the tabloids on you constantly and to have a whole pack of hyenas who are constantly circling, looking to draw blood at every moment. And Donald Trump survived for 30 years in that environment by doing all sorts of things, a lot of feints and misdirection and leaks that he does himself. And, there was that famous story about him actually impersonating, pretending to be some PR person he would call and give information. And there are reporters today who say, that was Donald Trump. It was actually him giving information about himself. That only seems strange unless you understand the environment in New York City in which people have to outwit each other. And again, I would say, understand that he's had to survive over many decades, and he has survived and thrived in that environment. Put it together with his Queens upbringing and the Norman Vincent Peale book, and you understand the environment that created Trump and that he survived in. And it makes 99.9% of everything that comes out of his mouth or comes out of his body language, it all makes sense. It all makes perfect sense. Also, if you haven't read Art of the Deal, I would suggest reading that.
It's just that he's so different than any president we have ever had, who thought it was so important to say exactly the right thing every time they spoke. And Trump just isn't that man.
It is a combination of the fact that he does a lot of anti-politician things as far as presentation, but also this culture, and there's always been a vicious culture to New York. I mean, New York's always been a tough place, and we haven't really had someone from New York since Wilson. And Wilson, by the way, was no wallflower. But we have not had a president basically in 100 years who comes out of that New York City environment. And I think that that's a little startling. People are used to seeing it in movies and in television, and they sort of understand that New York environment, but they've never seen it embodied in a president before, at least in our lifetimes. And I think that is a little startling. So actress Martha Plimpton, who comes from a rather well-to-do family and didn't have much of a Hollywood career, but you might remember her as the older sister from Goonies, was at a pro-abortion rally in Seattle and said the following: "Seattle has some particular significance for me for lots of reasons. I've got a lot of family here, some of whom are here in the audience tonight. I also had my first abortion here at the Seattle Planned Parenthood." Then there were claps and cheers. And she says, "Notice I said first, and I don't want Seattle, I don't want you guys to feel insecure. It was my best one." Laughter from the crowd at this point. "Heads and tails above the rest. If I could Yelp review it, I totally would. And if that doctor's here tonight, I don't remember you at all. I was 19, but I thank you nonetheless." End quote, Martha Plimpton. And that went around this week, and I think people were appropriately aghast that she would somehow make fun of and celebrate the abortion that she had. But it got me, the only reason I read that quote is it got me to thinking that if the average voter in this country went to a convention where environmentalists gather to plot their next political push, or if the average voter went to a Democrat convention, a state convention, and actually listened to the kinds of things that people say when they're at these far left gatherings, I think the anti-left vote would double overnight in the United States. And I would suggest that if you can stomach it, it's an interesting experience. If you see some environmental program or even a march, go to one of these one time. It's hard to get into a Democrat convention if you're not a credentialed person. But if you can find one of these environments where the lefties are gathering and you can take it for a few hours, go and hang out and pretend that you're with the left for just a few hours and engage people in conversations. You will be shocked at the kinds of things that people will say people on the left will say when they're in their comfort zone. There's this myth on the left that somehow when conservatives are in a room together and it's only them, that they put on the white hoods and immediately just begin saying racist things all the time. Nothing could be farther from the truth. Most people on the right are fairly religious, and you don't hear a lot of swearing when you're around conventions or gatherings of politically active conservatives. It's actually quite calm. And for the most part, if there are any debates, it's very reasoned and based on logic, which is part of the reason why we lose a lot of elections, because we think that somehow the logical argument is the one that's going to win the day. But I'm telling you, because I've been to them, if you hang out with leftists at their events, logic is not the greatest concern. And the kinds of things that come out of people's mouths will absolutely shock you. But they believe it. They believe it.
So what do you think is going to happen with North Korea, Matt?
I think the first thing to recognize, as Steve Bannon said when he gave that not-so-wise interview to a leftist magazine a month ago, is there isn't going to be any military conflict with North Korea. I mean, unless they actually fire off a nuclear weapon, there will be no preemptive strike on North Korea. It's in no one's interest to do it. It will cost too many South Koreans their lives. And it's, in some ways, probably what some people in North Korea want. And so there's no reason to do that. And so that's the first thing I'd say is just keep in mind that when you're hearing the president talk, or China or Russia, anybody, no matter what they're saying, no matter even if they're warning that war is imminent, that's all just strategy and manipulation. People are trying to get the upper hand in these negotiations. North Korea is China's creature, and they do not want to give up. North Korea is this sort of
rabid dog.
Yeah, they're sort of a asymmetrical player in the mix. They keep North Korea on a leash so that they can use it as a way to prevent American dominance in the Asian theater. I believe the president is actually slowly but surely maneuvering China into a position where they're going to have to get rid of North Korea. They're going to have to solve that problem, something they don't really want to do. I think at its core, that's what we need to remember, is that if China really wanted North Korea to go away as a problem, they could make that happen. I'm going to say that again. If China wanted the North Korea problem solved, it would be. Through assassination or whatever it took, China can solve that. North Korea is their creation, but it serves their purposes. And the president is trying an economic approach where they've already started to suggest now that if you do business with North Korea, then we're not going to do business with you. Well, the only person really that North Korea does business with is China. So this is a way of targeting Chinese banks and the Chinese economy. That's got the Chinese very alarmed, but they're in a bad position because they look like they're defending nuclear rogue actor, what have you. I personally think that, having lived in China for a year, I have seen the kind of hysterical overreaction that the Chinese have to the Japanese. They carry a lot of PTSD around the Japanese invasion of China 80 years ago, and they are building their own military, and the last thing that they would want to see is the Japanese military coming back. Because we forced them after World War II to have a constitution that does not really allow them to have much of a military at all. And I think that the threat of allowing Japan to remilitarize would get the concessions that you want from China. Essentially, my strategy would be to begin a process to militarize the Japanese, like a 10-step process, in which, say, past item number 4, it would be irreversible. So I would have this 10-step process for revising the Japanese constitution so that they could then militarize, and then a program for aiding them in doing that and training their folks, and a crash program for them to make tanks and planes and ships and the rest. And I would work that out into a 10-point program over, say, 3 years. And then I would bring in the Chinese ambassador or meet directly with the Chinese premier, and I would say, here's the 10-point program. And I'm going to start it tomorrow. And when I get to item number 4 in about 8 months, it will be irreversible. Before that, I can change, I can stop, I can reverse course and I'll use an excuse to stop this process. But you just need to know that once I get to number 4, there's no coming back, and the Japanese are going to militarize. And so you have 8 months to solve the North Korea problem.
Clever.
And then let them decide, because it's basically a winner either way. Because if you militarize the Japanese, you have created an ongoing problem for the Chinese, and you've essentially created your own dog on a leash that they are going to have to contend with. Or they capitulate on North Korea and the problem is solved. Now, I would bet 95% chance that the Chinese cave, because as much as they don't want to give up the North Korean junkyard dog, they would never want to see Japan militarize if they can avoid it. That's an ongoing problem for them decade after decade after decade that they do not want to see created. So they would find some face-saving way of getting rid of the North Korea problem in which they look like they're the hero or they stepped in and did what was right, and it would happen.
Are they afraid of the Japanese?
Terribly.
Why?
Well, the Japanese dominated them for years, came in, invaded Manchuria, murdered many, and the Japanese they conquered most of Southeast Asia too. They struck us at Pearl Harbor. They're quite effective. I would say this, and I think the Chinese understand this. The Japanese are far more precise, and so their military is much more intimidating as a concept. It's the Japanese are kind of the Germans when it comes to precision, of Asia. And so if the Chinese and the Japanese had the exact same size military and they were going into battle, I would bet all my money on the Japanese. I think people just kind of understand that they're very effective warriors, something that they have not been involved in doing for some time. The Chinese do not want to be in an arms race with the Japanese. They just don't. And they certainly don't want to be in any kind of a conflict with them, because I don't they have a lot of, like I said, PTSD from what happened before. Now, they are, of course, much more industrialized. They would give as good as they get. They could hold their own in any battle with the Japanese. But what they don't want is the expenditure, right? I mean, they don't want to have to keep up with militarizing Japan, which, when it comes to ships and planes and precision missiles and all the rest, look, they built Hondas. They can build very deadly military equipment, and the Chinese just don't want to see them doing that. So all of which is to say, I would take that road with the Chinese. But in the end, the president's taking an economic route to doing that. I think that can also work. The point here being that there are ways to get the Chinese to capitulate, but one has to be stubborn and methodical and determined. And I think we have all of that in the current president of the United States. So I want to talk a little bit about Hollywood for a few minutes. And I want to play a couple of clips for you from movies that came out in the last 30 or 40 years. I could do this for an hour. I could play clips for an hour, but I'm just going to select two, and I want you to listen to them, and then I'm going to talk about why and how Hollywood does what it does, which is to push a leftist agenda. So here are the two quotes.
The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA.
You can't handle the truth! Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's gonna do it? You? I have a greater responsibility than you can possibly fathom. You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. We use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as the backbone of a life spent defending something. You use them as a punchline. I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide, and then questions the manner in which I provide it.
Okay, so that was Gordon Gekko from Wall Street, 1987. And then following him was Colonel Nathan Jessup, a character in A Few Good Men, a Rob Reiner movie from 1992. So what did those two quotes have in common? Well, first of all, I would say that both of those quotes became quite popular. People actually still requote them and enjoy them. There's also a quote from Glengarry Glen Ross about a sales contest that's quite famous among salesmen. But the writers did not intend for those quotes to become beloved in the way that they are. Those are just two examples of the ways in which the Hollywood left, which is to say Hollywood, undermines American values and pushes a liberal, left, anti-American, internationalist agenda. Not all the time, mind you, but most of the time. And here are 4 ways that they do it. First, they choose which stories to tell and which to ignore. How many movies about McCarthyism has Hollywood made versus how many movies about how brutal the Soviets and the Chinese were to their own people? How many movies like that have been made? The communist movement of the 20th century was responsible for killing more people than any ideology in history, roughly 100 million people. Second place would be Rachel Carson and the environmental movement, which has been responsible for African deaths in the millions, starting with her book Silent Spring and the ban on DDT. But second place isn't even close to first place, and Hitler comes in third. Hollywood has made more movies attacking American anti-communist foreign and domestic policy than it has about the horrific Stalinist and Maoist ideologies those policies were trying to oppose. Secondly, always make the Republican the bad guy. Those quotes I played for you are excellent examples of how Hollywood writers, who are mostly socialists, write words Republicans would agree with and then place them in the mouths of villains. So Gordon Gekko was a lying, cheating stock trader. Jessup was a murderer. Pay attention to who the bad guys are in most movies. Corporations, wealthy businessmen, men in general, Christian fundamentalists. Many of Michael Crichton's novels have been made into high-grossing movies. But he wrote a book shortly before he died called State of Fear, in which the villains are a bunch of environmentalists who have become terrorists. What do you think the chances are that will ever be made into a movie? It's been over 10 years, and I haven't heard one word about anyone even considering making that Michael Crichton book into a movie.
Certainly not Al Gore.
Thirdly, if you don't like the reality, make one up. Someone once said that after America failed to win the war in Vietnam on the battlefield, we decided to win it on the big screen. And that's why we got movies like Missing in Action and Rambo. When Hollywood lost the 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush, they reacted by creating their own liberal president. You'll remember the West Wing came along shortly after that. And that president solved the Israeli-Palestinian crisis, sent his former chief of staff to meet privately with Fidel Castro, and advocated policies such as giving children the right to vote. In this left fantasy land, the notorious drunk in the Senate is a Republican from Florida. And the California legislature is controlled by Republicans. And eventually in that storyline, a pro-choice Republican who doesn't believe in God wins his party's nomination for president. With half of Hillary Clinton's staff going to work at ABC to create that show Commander-in-Chief, no one could argue that that movie was anything other than an attempt to pave the way for her in 2008. All of which didn't work, because Obama got elected, but then you'll notice that in anticipation of her running again in 2016, suddenly the network has this show, Madam Secretary. Lastly, the subtext of movies and TV shows, liberal death by 1,000 cuts. Most of Hollywood's leftism is subtle. You hear it in throwaway lines or subplots. During the first 10 years of this century, W's foreign policy was attacked in such movies as Star Wars 3. Remember that they had Anakin, who would eventually become Darth Vader, saying, "You're either with me or against me," which was a paraphrase of Bush's line of "You're either with us or against us." So they put it in the mouth of Darth Vader. And then there were television programs like Fox's 24, a show which I actually enjoyed a lot. But in season 2, the president must resist pressure to attack Middle Eastern countries on evidence that turns out to be false. That's not a coincidence. Look, movies and television shows are carefully crafted by artists who want their work to have meaning. If you think personal politics doesn't seep into their work, you've never hung out with artists. And if you're not watching Hollywood products with an awareness of the constant leftist ideology, you're playing the dupe. I'm not suggesting to check out from Hollywood entirely, although I know a lot of you listening have done that. I still enjoy some movies and televisions from time to time, but it's basically the same as watching television commercials. You understand when you're watching a television commercial that you're being actively manipulated and that the people are trying to sell you something. And being aware of that in some ways inoculates you from it, because you can say, I know why they're putting those pretty girls there with the bottles of beer. They think somehow they can equate sex with beer, and then I'm going to buy their product. And if you can recognize that, you have dispelled the magic. The same thing is my advice when it comes to movies and television. Enjoy. There are a lot of great stories, and there can be a lot of fun shows and movies to watch, but never forget that the people who are behind them, who have spent countless hours creating them, and who've spent millions of dollars to put that in front of your eyes, are never, as Rahm Emanuel would have said, going to waste the opportunity to teach you something or to nudge you in the direction they want you to go. Be aware. So another example, for instance, is look at how many trans characters have appeared in shows. Joris and I have talked about this before, but nearly every show now has a trans character. I believe that if you watch television, you would believe that there are far more trans characters than there are in real life, actual folks who are trans. There are so many things that television and movies push out there as things that they're trying to do to affect the culture. It is a constant refrain in TV and movies that somehow women enjoy one-night stands in the same way that a man would. That is not true. There's no evidence of that in real life. You also see this image of the kick-ass woman. This has come along since Laura Croft and other things in the last 15 years, that we have all of these women who are really tough fighters, and they're beating the crap out of men. We saw Atomic Blonde this summer, and that was probably a good example of the woman who was beating the crap out of men. What is completely overlooked, of course, is the difference in upper body strength between men and women. And I see this now all the time, where in a one-on-one fight, the woman dominates the man he's not some overweight guy who just struggled out of the bar. He's usually like clearly an ex-SEAL member or some kind of guy who works out constantly and is in great shape, and he's a mercenary. So it's women like Charlize Theron, who's a nice lady and a bit on the tall side, but she's not beefy in any sense. And when she goes up against a man who works out and who is clearly has maximum body strength, the idea that she's going to dominate him in a one-on-one physical confrontation is ridiculous. But that gets portrayed constantly now, the kick-ass woman who can take not only one Navy SEAL type man, but like 5 at a time. There's also constant messages about toxic masculinity. If men aren't portrayed as kind of boobs or ridiculous, then everything they say and do is essentially wrong and is toxic in some way or another. The other constant refrain you see is the happy divorce. People are separating and everything's just okay and the kids love it. There's no problems. That's portrayed constantly when everyone who's been through a divorce or experienced all of that understands that it's the exact opposite of the truth. They will deliver messages in kids shows, in comedies. It's all designed to shape and nudge. Communist screenwriters during the 30s and 40s actually took pride in their ability to slip in subversive messages into movies, and they would meet at each other's houses with some regularity to brag about what they were able to do. TV really started changing in the 1970s when Norman Mailer came along with All in the Family. He wrote that Archie Bunker character, that racist, as his blatant attack on white Christian America, something he brags about now. That was designed to portray an entire section of America, to run it down. He put all of the subversive messages that he wanted to get out there into the mouth of Archie Bunker. So I did watch the first season of Transparent, which is a show entirely about a man who late in his life is decided that he's always wanted to be a woman, and so he's transitioning. What I found interesting about the show is that everyone in his family is dysfunctional except for him. So the reality, the false reality that the show tries to put out there is that the trans character is the most rational, sane person in the show, and that his children and his wife and his friends all have all sorts of mental problems and hang-ups. Now, that is the exact opposite of the truth. We know statistically that a lot of folks in the trans community are dealing with mental health issues. But that's the kind of thing that Hollywood will do. They'll create a family that has a trans character, and then they will, because they get to write the reality, they'll make the trans character the most rational, the most logical, the most mentally healthy person in the whole entourage. Even Game of Thrones, a show that I enjoy a lot, is filled with anti-male, pro-female themes. All of the women in the show are strong women. Even Cersei, the evil queen, is strong. The men in the show are brave, but often portrayed as blunderers. There's a female character, one of the leads is Jon Snow, and there is an entire season in which one female character is constantly saying to him, "You know nothing, Jon Snow." She says that phrase over and over again all season long. And then the men are also portrayed as queen worshippers, or in some cases, just completely inept. There is a lot of anti-male dialogue in Game of Thrones if you pay attention. All of which, again, is to say that there are a lot of good shows worth watching, but you have to do it with your brain turned on to the fact that there is always some message being pushed. And if you haven't figured out what the message is that's being pushed, then it's still subliminal and it's still working on you. On that subject, Doris and I are getting ready for the fall TV shows to begin again, and we racked our brain last night to think about what we would recommend to folks, and sad to say we were not able to come up with many shows that we would recommend, so we're down to basically 4, and it's really 3 with 1 which is brand new, and we have some hopes for it. So both of us like This Is Us, which I believe plays on NBC. I think some of you already may be watching that. If you aren't, that's a good show, very family friendly show, and we recommend it. Outlander is a show on the Starz channel that is based on books, and it's essentially about a woman in the 1950s who, through some magic, is in Scotland, is able to transport back about 300 years, and she is there during the Scottish rebellion against the crown. Maybe it's 400 years. And so she has a husband in the 1950s when she travels back in time, but then, of course, she thinks she's never coming back when she finds herself in this other time period, and she ends up falling in love with a man there and marrying him. It sounds a little hokey when I describe it, but it's actually kind of well carried off. I would say it's very popular among women. It has a strong kind of romantic vibe to it, but it also, for history buffs like me, I think they do a really good job of recreating the time period. And while it does have some feminist themes that don't really work for the time period that they are portraying, and so it didn't take me very long to understand, again, what the subliminal message was that was being pushed. But once you can see that and sort of ignore it, it's still a pretty enjoyable show. You like it, right, Doris?
Yes, it's one of my favorites.
Thirdly, I would recommend Strange Days. It's going to be coming back for its second season on Netflix. This show really was extremely well produced. It's kind of it takes place in the 80s, and it's a bit of a thriller horror film, although it's not a horror film like a slasher film. It's just a little bit scary in that they're dealing with an alternate universe, and a little bit kind of like Poltergeist, I guess, might be another movie to compare it to. But what I really find brilliant about it, first of all, the main cast is 4 young kids, and they're all great actors. So it's got that kind of Goonies vibe to it. But secondly, you would, if you didn't know that the television show was made last year, you could think that it was made in the 1980s. The production values are so exquisitely executed that it feels like not only that it takes place in the 80s, but that it was made in the 80s. And so it's got this great vibe for the time period that it carries off very well. And then a very engaging plot and some fun kid actors, and so I highly recommend the show. Lastly, and this is the one that Doris and I simply have some hope for, Ken Burns has a new documentary coming out this fall, multi-part series on the Vietnam War. Now, I have soured on Ken Burns. I still think that his original work on the Civil War is extraordinary. And then he did a bunch of series. I liked the one on baseball, but everything got progressively more political as he went along. And I watched the one on the national parks, and it was sort of half entertaining and exactly what I wanted, and half him constantly pushing a leftist agenda. So I could kind of barely get through that series on the national parks. And then I didn't even bother on the Roosevelts, because at that point, I mean, when he's actually doing it on the Roosevelts, you kind of know where that's going. But I'm going to check out the Vietnam one because, of course, it's a fascinating subject, and I'm hoping that he can do for the Vietnam War what he did for the Civil War. But I have real concerns that the war is too recent and still too political for him not to bring his leftist agenda to it. So we'll just have to see. But those are our recommendations for the fall. I wish that I could give you more recommendations out there. There are other shows that I watch, but I don't enjoy them enough to actually make a recommendation for them.
Well, I've got some things to add to that. There is one returning show that I recommend, and it's called Lethal Weapon. It's on Fox, and it starts at 8 p.m. on September 26th.
That's coming back for its second season, right?
Exactly, but the 2 main characters play off each other very well, and it's both has good plots and some comedy, so I enjoy that. And of course, I'll be watching the old standbys, Blue Bloods and Hawaii Five-0. Also, I'm going to check out these new shows. Star Trek Discovery. The pilot will be on CBS on Sunday, 9/24. But after that, you'll only be able to find it on CBS All Access. And then there's The Brave, a military drama starting on Monday, 9/25. That's at 10 p.m. on NBC. And I'm also going to check out The Good Doctor. It's a new medical drama about a young surgeon with autism and savant syndrome. And it'll be on ABC at 10 p.m. starting on 9/25. Then for people old enough to remember the old Dynasty show, it was an 80s primetime soap. It is coming back at 9 p.m. on October 11th on CW.
So that's 4 new shows you're going to be checking out. I'm going to make a prediction right now that you will like only one of them.
And which one would that be?
I don't know which one. But of those 4, I personally I have very low expectations for all of them, and my prediction is that there will be no more than one of those shows that Doris will tell us she actually enjoys once she's checked them out. So this Sunday is the Wrath of Khan. Those of you everywhere, you check your local listings. Likely there is a showing of the Wrath of Khan, Star Trek II, with William Shatner and Ricardo Montalban playing at your local theater. Doris and I have dutifully recorded the episode of the original Star Trek series called The Space Seed, in which the Khan character is introduced, and we are going to watch that Friday or Saturday, and then we're going to go to the movie for its 35th anniversary showing on Sunday. So I encourage any of you who are Trekkies or have children who like Star Trek, don't miss the opportunity to see Star Trek Wrath of Khan in the theaters on the big screen. That is the best Star Trek movie, and what a nice way to spend your Sunday afternoon.
And that's put on by Fathom Events.
Right. So we're just about out of time. You can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, and Pocket Cast. This is a labor of love, but we need to grow. I'm begging and pleading for you to share this with a friend. And please like our show. And remember, Trump supporters, you are not alone. Goodbye, Doris.
Goodbye, Matt.